Hi guys, it's Sophie. So I'm going to be doing another Mad Booker review today, and that is In Our Mad and Furious City by Gunaratne. This book was one of the ones I knew probably the least about when I picked it up, and was interested and kind of mostly around the fact that it was a urban England setting, because I don't read a lot of that really. I read some stuff from cities in general, but not a lot set in the UK, I suppose, and a lot of what I read anyway tends to be more in the sticks than it does in a town. So this book follows three young men in a period of 48 hours in London, following an attack on a soldier from someone who was Muslim and was kind of extremist in their views, and that is mimicking the Lee Rigby killing, which those of you from the UK might not be aware of, but it was quite a similar, very similar actually, even in the way the kind of crime happened, event that happened in the UK, and it did have these ripples through society. So that's kind of the background in real life to this story. But this book in particular follows these three young men and the after effect, the kind of ripples of the murder of this soldier in this version of London. And all of the boys, bar one, live on this estate, and even the boy who lives off the estate kind of feels like he lives more in the estate than he does at his home. And they are kind of trying to find themselves and figure out what it is they want to do. One of the boys is kind of unsure about his faith and what he wants to do. A lot of people in the Muslim community he's in have become much more radical and traditional following the death of his father, who's an imam, and he's kind of trying to figure out whether or not he wants to kind of maintain this quite passive version of Islam that his dad preached, or this more fundamental version that's being preached in the mosque closest to him now. There's one boy who is very driven and very athletic, and spends kind of hours and hours running and honing his body to try and get himself out of this situation and maybe move up. He kind of dreams of being in the Olympics, and spends all his time doing that. And then there's a third boy who is probably an outcast if it weren't for the friends that he has, these boys he has as his friends, who is quite small physically, but is a rapper and spends a lot of his time kind of coming up with like lyrics and kind of just rapping on rooftops and stuff. And he might not have a lot of physical punch, but his words have a lot of punch. There are other characters woven in, but my sense was that they help to explain the boys' stories as opposed to necessarily being storylines of their own. So there's one lady called Caroline who, her story is really about explaining the IRA and the historic impact that the IRA had in terms of the bombings and the feeling against Irish people, which highlights what's kind of happening with Muslim people. And another man who immigrated to the UK, who was black and had the experience of like keep Britain white and all of those sorts of things to highlight the race element as opposed to the religious element of the same problem the boys are facing. So whilst their stories did stand on their own, I felt as though they were more sort of like lights to highlight what was happening to the boys. I think one of the things I found most intriguing about this as a reading experience is that I don't come from anywhere near this kind of life. I live in the middle of nowhere in a very rural place. I live in a little town, but still in the middle of nowhere. And the language use, the kind of slang use, is something I'm so unfamiliar with. So just purely as just a reading experience, there were so many words that I wasn't quite sure what they were and had to kind of look up. And I expect lots of people who live in London would think that's a bit silly, but yeah, I didn't know what they were talking about at some stages. I think really that's kind of, I don't want to say too much more about the plot, because I think that's sort of it beyond bits that could be classed as spoilers. I don't really know what I thought of this. I find it quite a difficult one. I think I quite enjoyed reading it, but I found to some extent the novelty of the writing was what drew me in originally. And I felt a little bit uncomfortable with how close to reality the setup of the novel was. I don't know, it feels quite close, and I kind of felt a bit like I kind of wished I was reading non-fiction about it, but I get what it is, but it was just kind of these slight niggling things of me saying, am I as into this book as I think I am right now, or is it that I'm intrigued by this setting and language use that I'm very unfamiliar with, and then tied with, does this feel like something I would choose to read as a novel? And I think probably no. I think I probably have chosen to read this story as non-fiction, which is somewhat different to kind of the merit of the book. It's more about how I'm interpreting that experience. It's a quite difficult one to know whether to recommend or not because of that. I think if you're either someone like me who's quite removed from that world, or you're someone from another part of the world, you may need some help with the slang. I don't know if British slang is the same as American slang or Canadian slang or Australian slang, but I doubt it. But I found it was fairly straightforward to kind of figure out what they were saying as I went through. I do think it's an interesting take, and I like the fact that it was focusing on boys, whilst there were bits of this that I found almost unreadable and did kind of spoil it a bit for me in the treatment of women. I feel as though I've seen more of this story from young women than young men. That doesn't excuse the treatment of women in here, and I think overall the treatment of women is fairly poor. There's only one real female voice, who is the woman called Caroline, who's kind of highlighting the IRA story, but the rest girls are kind of props. But I do kind of get that. There's one quite nasty scene about a sexual act. But I think I did like the fact it was young male, which I don't feel young male under privileged areas I see or hear much of in literature. So I liked that was there. Yeah, it's a tricky one. If you've read it, I'd just love to know what you thought, because I haven't found anyone else, I haven't seen any other reviews yet, although I haven't been on my booktube for a while, of people talking about this. If you have read it and you have thoughts, do share them down below. Yeah, I don't know, it's a tricky one. I think it could be shortlisted. I don't think it could win, but we'll see. It depends on the judges. I don't think it would win. I think it could be shortlisted. Anyway, I will chat to you guys soon in my next video, and look after yourselves until then. Bye bye.